They didn't ask. They didn't warn. One morning I looked out over my grandfather's ranch, and there it was. Bulldozers carving a scar through the heart of our land, laying pipe like they owned the earth beneath my boots. Have you ever stood on your family's legacy, land passed down through blood and sweat, and watched strangers tear it open like it was nothing? What would you do if someone tried to rip apart everything your family built without even knocking on your door? The ranch had always been more than just land. It was where my father taught me to shoot, where my mother planted her roses near the porch, where Grandpa carved our names into the old oak stump after every harvest. Every fence post, every cattle trail, every dusty ridge carried a piece of us. I moved back after Grandpa passed, leaving the city behind to take care of the place. I promised him on his deathbed that I'd never sell, never let the ranch fall into the wrong hands. "Keep it breathing, son," he whispered. "They'll come for it. Promise me you'll fight." At the time, I didn't understand. Who would come for a ranch 3 hours outside the city, hidden behind rolling hills and winding gravel roads? But I gave him my word. 3 months later, I found out exactly who he meant. It started quiet. The first hint was a drone flying overhead. Just a little hum in the sky. I thought maybe some kids were messing around. Then came the survey flags, tiny orange and white markers stabbing the soil along the fence line. I pulled them up, tossed them in the trash, and thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The real trouble showed up on a Monday morning. I'd just fed the horses and was heading back to the house when I heard engines rumbling up the south ridge. 3 trucks, a backhoe, 2 guys in hard hats stepping out like they had a deed in their pockets. They didn't even look at me, just pointed at their maps and started measuring distances. I walked right up to the one in charge, a guy with sunglasses and a clipboard, and said, "You lost?" He didn't flinch, didn't apologize, just said, "You're in parcel 7B, sir. This stretch is part of a utility easement. We'll be laying pipe starting this week." "What easement?" I asked, cold burning through my chest. He flipped the clipboard around and showed me a document I'd never seen before, some county paperwork stamped 6 months ago. It mentioned something about a regional water distribution project. But the signature wasn't mine, and it damn sure wasn't Grandpa's. "I never signed this," I said. "Not required," he replied flatly. "The HOA that governs the Lakeside Ridge subdivision filed for it. The line cuts through your southern acreage. You'll be compensated per foot." That was when the world started tilting. The HOA, the housing development 10 miles down the mountain, full of vinyl-fenced homes and synthetic lawns. They were building a water pipeline, and somehow they had permission to dig through my ranch. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You can't just tear through private land." He gave me that bureaucratic smirk, the kind that makes your fists itch. "It's not private anymore, not this part. The right-of-way was granted by the county. It's in the agreement." Agreement? What agreement? I'd never even talked to the HOA. I didn't live in their subdivision, didn't vote in their meetings. My land wasn't under their jurisdiction. At least I thought it wasn't. That night I drove into town and pulled every land document I could get from the county clerk. My grandfather's name was still on most of the titles, but deep in the stack I found a tiny amendment filed 10 years ago. It transferred a narrow easement to a community water utility district, a vague shell entity tied directly to the HOA. It was buried under technical language, but the intent was clear. They had loopholed their way into a decades-old water supply scheme, and my land was now the conduit. Grandpa must have missed it, or maybe he was coerced. The amendment was filed right around the time he had a stroke, but none of that mattered now. The pipeline was coming, and if I didn't stop it, they'd run it straight through the old corral and down into the canyon, right where our cattle grazed and our well drew water. By Wednesday, they'd already broken ground. The land shook beneath the machines. Dust clouds rolled over the fields. Fence posts were pulled up like weeds. The men didn't talk to me. They worked like ants, focused, fast, efficient. I tried everything. Called the sheriff. Called the county. The answers were the same. It's legal. They followed the process. File a civil suit if you have a problem. But court takes time, and I didn't have it. Every hour they worked, more of the ranch disappeared under concrete and pipe. And the worst part? They were planning to hook their entire development into our spring, our natural water source that fed the land, the animals, the garden, the house. Once they tapped it, there was no going back. I stood at the spring that night, crouched beside the mossy rocks where the water trickled like it had for generations. The moon reflected off the surface, calm and silent, as if mocking me. And I remembered Grandpa's words again. They'll come for it. Promise me you'll fight. Something inside me broke loose. Not in rage, but in clarity. If they thought I was going to roll over and let them gut our legacy, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I didn't sleep that night. I drove 6 hours to meet with an old friend of Grandpa's, a retired water rights attorney who owed him a favor. He looked over the documents and shook his head. This is theft disguised as procedure, he muttered, but you're on the losing side unless you flip the board. I asked him what he meant. He leaned in, eyes sharp. You don't fight this with signs and letters. You fight it with leverage. That word rang in my ears all the way home. Leverage. By morning, I knew what I had to do. If they wanted water, if they thought they could build their pretty little subdivision off our spring, then I'd take the one thing they didn't think could be bought. The source. Because the spring didn't start on my land. It started 5 miles upstream near the abandoned forest tract that fed the underground flow. I remembered it from childhood hikes, how Grandpa always warned me not to go near the old timberline because it was not for sale. But times had changed. The previous owners had died off, and from what I'd heard, the property was sitting idle. I made a call, then another, and within a week I was sitting at a diner across from the last living heir of the upland tract. A quiet man, hands like bark, eyes tired from too many winters. He looked at me and said, "You want the whole ridge?" I nodded. "I'll pay whatever it takes." He chewed on his lip, glanced out the window. "That spring's still flowing?" "More than ever," I said. "And if I don't own it by next month, someone else will." He sighed. "Your granddad was a good man. He helped my brother when no one else would. You're the first to ask straight. No games." He gave me his number. We shook hands. And by the time I returned to the ranch, the paperwork was in motion. Meanwhile, the HOA had no idea what was coming. They thought I was just some backwoods rancher scrambling to save a few fence posts. But I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was about to shut off the supply and watch their entire system crumble. Buying the source wasn't enough. I thought owning the ridge would stop them cold, but I was wrong. It only revealed how deep their scheme truly ran. A week after the sale closed, I stood on the high ridge, boots planted on newly deeded ground, watching the spring bubble quietly from the earth. It was beautiful, raw, untouched, primal. Beneath the brush, the water carved its way into my family's land below. It was the pulse of everything we owned. And now, legally, it was mine, from root to riverbed. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought shutting the valve at the source would bring their project to a halt. But 2 days later, they were still digging, still laying pipe, still acting like they owned the flow. That's when I knew I was missing something. I climbed down to the trench line myself, walked past the machines, and confronted the project supervisor. "You're trespassing," I said, flatly, pointing at the markers where my deeded land began. "That pipe runs through water I own." He looked up from his clipboard, sunglasses reflecting the midday sun. "You own the land," he said, "but not the flow." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means," he replied slowly, "the water rights were transferred before you. Bought the source. The HOA's contract predates your deed. We're not trespassing, we're following code." That word again, code. Like it was armor. I turned without answering. My blood was boiling, but anger wasn't going to win this fight. I needed answers. Real ones. I went straight back to the county office. This time not just to read titles and amendments, but to dig into the HOA's history. What I found made my stomach turn. 10 years ago, just after Grandpa's first stroke, the Lakeside Ridge HOA filed a petition to form a special Community Utilities Board. Their claim? They needed a long-term water solution for their growing neighborhood. But what they actually did was much worse. They used legal ambiguity to file what's called a non-consensual utility easement. Normally, this would be contested, but they buried the filing during a time when Grandpa was incapacitated and no legal heirs had stepped forward yet. Worse still, their filing was based on a geological survey that claimed the water didn't originate from our land, but from a publicly shared aquifer beneath the HOA district. The survey was fabricated. They'd paid a private firm, one that was later disbanded after multiple fraud allegations, to create the illusion of shared supply. It was a house of lies, carefully stacked. But they didn't count on one thing: me coming home. That night, I stayed up combing through scanned documents, phone records, and archived HOA minutes I pulled from public records. That's when the real picture started to emerge. This wasn't just about water. It was about development. The HOA had plans. Big ones. They were quietly lobbying for zoning expansions that would double the number of homes in their district over the next 5 years. But the only way to make that possible was to secure a permanent, high-capacity water source. My spring. They never wanted just a pipe. They wanted control. Their board president, a smug ex-attorney named Daniel Whitmore, was the one pulling strings. His name kept popping up everywhere, in the survey contracts, in county communications, even in the shell company used to file the land amendment. Whitmore wasn't just building homes. He was consolidating power, and he knew exactly what he was doing. The next morning, I drove straight to Lakeside Ridge and parked just outside the HOA office. It was one of those faux stone buildings with a cheap brass logo and tinted windows. When I walked in, the receptionist looked up, startled. I wasn't what she expected: dust-covered boots, flannel shirt, and fury in my eyes. "I need to speak with Daniel Whitmore," I said. She hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, stepping forward. "But tell him the man who owns his water is here." That got his attention. 10 minutes later, Whitmore strolled into the lobby, calm and polished, like he was walking into a negotiation. Blue suit, crisp tie, not a speck of sweat on him. "Ah," he said, smiling, without warmth. "Mr. Granger, is it? I've been meaning to reach out. You're tapping a spring that doesn't belong to you." His smile tightened. "Legally, it's a permitted connection under the regional utility plan. The paperwork is sound. You forged geological data. That public aquifer claim is bogus." "That's a strong accusation," he replied smoothly. "And I assume you have evidence?" I didn't answer. "Not yet." "You're welcome to take legal action," he added, adjusting his cufflinks. "Though I should warn you, it will be costly. We're fully backed by a multi-year development agreement. By the time your case is heard, construction will be complete." I stepped closer. "I don't think you understand. I don't need a court to shut you down. I just need a wrench." He froze for half a second. It was subtle, but I saw it. The flicker of unease. "You can't block access," he said quickly. "That's illegal interference." "But I can. Shut off the flow upstream. I own the surface. I own the spring. You may think you have rights, but without supply, your pipe is just a tube in the dirt." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and left him standing there. The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. I hired a private hydrologist, one with a clean record and no ties to the county. I paid him cash to run a complete geological survey of the spring and its tributaries. His conclusion? Crystal clear. The water originated solely on my land with no subsurface tie to the HOA district. I also reached out to a local journalist, one who had written pieces before on shady HOA dealings. I gave her everything: documents, maps, the forged survey, even Whitmore's shell company filings. She promised to dig deeper and go public once we had physical proof of diversion. That proof came sooner than expected. The pipeline crew had reached the lower ridge by then, And they weren't just digging. They'd started laying concrete to build a small pumping station on my land. No permits, no notice. That was the final straw. That night, I drove back to the source. Under the cover of darkness, I hiked to the inlet chamber near the ridge, a small concrete vault that directed the flow downward. I didn't need to destroy anything, just locked the valve and installed a tamper-proof cap. The spring kept flowing, but the line downstream went dry. By morning, the pipeline crew was in. Chaos. Pumps sputtered. Equipment shut down. Phone calls flew. I stood by the fence and watched them scramble. Then the emails came, first from the project engineer, then the utilities coordinator, and finally from Whitmore himself. Threats dressed as formal notices. Interference with critical infrastructure. Violation of municipal code. Cease and desist. I forwarded everything to my attorney and waited. That same afternoon, the journalist released her article. Developer fraud exposed in HOA pipeline scheme. Illegally tapped ranch spring May, fuel massive expansion. It went viral in our region within hours. By sunset, a county inspector had arrived at my gate, unannounced. I showed him the original deeds, the new survey, and the flow data. He was quiet for a long time. "This doesn't look good," he finally muttered. "No," I said. "It doesn't." He took photos, made some calls, and left. But I knew things. We're just getting started. Whitmore wouldn't back down easily. Men like him didn't build empires by quitting. But now he had a problem. He'd tried to steal water from a man who knew how to fight quietly, and hit where it hurt most. He may have built a pipe, but I controlled the tap, and next I was going to make sure the entire county knew it. They thought I'd fold under pressure, that I'd crumble under legal threats and bureaucratic weight. But what they didn't know was that I had grown up on this land. I was raised by storms and fire, and I had already buried stronger men than Daniel Whitmore. By the time the county inspector left, my mind was already working in layers. Step 1 had been to choke the pipeline. Step 2 was exposure. And that article had lit a fire I intended to keep burning. But step 3? That was war. Not the kind fought with fists or fire, but with leverage, paperwork, reputation. The HOA wanted my spring? Fine. I'd show them what it really cost to steal something sacred. I called a meeting, not with lawyers, but with neighbors. Real ones. Cattlemen. Farmers. Owners of the land surrounding Lakeside Ridge. Many of them had been watching the HOA from a distance for years, irritated by the slow creep of pavement, noise, and entitled residents who treated the country like a temporary theme park. But they never pushed back, because pushing back meant fighting money. Until now. I laid everything out on the table. The forged geological report, the pipeline trench slicing through ranch land, the secret zoning expansion Whitmore had filed under a dummy LLC, the unauthorized pumping station on my property. "I'm not asking you to swing a pickaxe," I said. "I'm asking you to stand with me, because if they get away with this, your land is next." There was silence for a moment. Then old man Carter, who owned 300 acres to the west, and stood up and said, "Hell, I've been waiting for an excuse." That's when the dominoes started to fall. By week's end, 4 other landowners had issued cease and desist letters of their own, citing unauthorized trenching, soil disruption, and water table tampering. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were co-defendants in a quiet rebellion. But the most critical blow came from the state's Department of Environmental Protection. That journalist I spoke to, she kept digging. Turns out the HOA's pipeline violated an ancient state conservation easement, one that protected historical aquifers running under the ranch territory. She filed a public report. The state responded. Suddenly, what had been a quiet local dispute was now flagged as a possible environmental violation. An investigation was opened. An injunction was filed. Construction froze. Whitmore, furious, tried to pivot. He held a press conference, blamed miscommunication, called it a temporary disruption caused by an uncooperative landowner, but the damage had been done. The article had gone statewide, then national, And that's when I played the ace I'd been holding since day one. See, while they were focusing on legal pathways and development permits, I had gone back through the original filing of their HOA charter. I found a clause buried in the footnotes. It stated that any communal resource, and including water, must be sourced from within the HOA's owned boundaries, or they were in breach of their own founding articles. You see what that means? By using water from my land outside, their district, the HOA had invalidated their charter. So I filed a formal grievance with the state HOA Oversight Board. It triggered a compliance audit. They had 60 days to prove lawful sourcing or face automatic dissolution. I didn't need to fight Whitmore anymore. He was fighting the law now. And losing. But it didn't stop there. The county, now under media scrutiny, launched a full investigation into Whitmore's zoning activity. Turns out he'd offered incentives and under-the-table deals to secure early approvals for the expansion project. One planning official quietly resigned. Another was subpoenaed. The house of cards was swaying, and I was watching from the front porch with a glass of cold, sweet tea. But it wasn't just strategy, and it was personal, too. One morning I found surveyors from the HOA back near the ridge. When I confronted them, they claimed they were remapping lines. I showed them the deed. They still didn't move. So I did what any Granger would do. I called the sheriff. He showed up 20 minutes later, hat low, boots muddy. Listened to both sides, read the deed. And then he looked at the crew and said, "Pack it up, boys, unless you want to be cited for trespass." That was the first time I saw them retreat, but not the last. The psychological warfare reached its peak when I attended the next HOA board meeting. I wasn't a resident, I had no vote. But I walked in anyway. Dozens of homeowners were packed inside, whispering, tense, eyes darting toward Whitmore. They'd seen the article, heard the news, watched the pipes go dry, and now they wanted answers. I sat in the back, silent, calm, waiting. When the floor opened for questions, I stood. "My name's Luke Granger," I said. "I'm the man who owns the land your water comes from." Gasps rippled across the room. "And I'm here to tell you, your board president lied to you. He stole from me, built without permits, fabricated documents, and now he's put every single one of you at risk." Whitmore stood up, voice strained. "That's enough." "No," I interrupted. "It's not. Because in 60 days your charter may be void. Your homes may lose essential services. And it won't be because of me. It'll be because your leadership tried to outsmart the law." Someone shouted from the crowd, "Is that true?" Whitmore didn't answer. He couldn't. His empire was collapsing in real time. That meeting ended in chaos. Residents yelling, demanding emergency elections. I didn't stick around. I'd said what I came to say. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was dipping low behind the hills. The pipeline sat dormant in the distance, its gray spine twisting uselessly through the earth. I started the engine and smiled, because I wasn't finished yet. I had one last move to make, and it was going to be the nail in the coffin. You see, while all this played out, I'd been quietly negotiating with the county's rural water co-op. They'd been trying for years to access higher quality spring flow for the surrounding ranches, so I struck a deal. I would donate easement rights, for free, on the condition that none of the flow would go to Lakeside Ridge. Ever. They agreed. New pipe was being laid on right now, drawing from the same source the HOA tried to steal. But instead of fueling tract homes and luxury lawns, it would water pasture land, fill cattle troughs, and nourish fields that had fed generations. The HOA tried to steal my spring. But I turned it into a river for everyone but them, and I wasn't done holding them accountable. Because next I was going to dismantle every permit they had ever filed, brick by brick. Line by line, they built their future on theft. Now they were watching it dry up, one cracked pipe at a time. The pipeline lay buried in silence now. No hum of pumps, no rush of stolen water beneath the soil. just rusting valves and empty promises sealed underground like a failed time capsule. I stood at the edge of my land that morning, boots planted, in the cool dirt, watching the sun rise over the ridge. For the first time in months there was peace, not just on the land, but inside me, because this wasn't just about a pipeline. It was about reclaiming a legacy. It was about drawing a line. That said, this far no further. The legal proceedings wrapped quietly on the surface. But beneath, their damage echoed like thunder. The HOA charter? Terminated by the Oversight Board. Once their illegal water sourcing was exposed, the board had no choice. Their governance dissolved. The homeowners panicked at first. Without an HOA, insurance premiums skyrocketed, maintenance halted, and disputes turned neighbor against neighbor. Some blamed Whitmore. Some blamed me. But truth has a funny way of rising, because once the county released the findings, detailing the forged zoning reports, the unpermitted trenching, the fabricated easements, there was no one left to defend him. Daniel Whitmore resigned 2 weeks later, not just from the HOA but from the company he'd used to push the expansion. His development projects stalled. His investors pulled out. His name, once whispered with admiration, now triggered lawsuits. I didn't rejoice. I didn't need to. His silence was louder than any courtroom verdict. But the real victory wasn't his fall. It was what came next. See, that spring, the one they tried to claim? It didn't just stay under my protection. It became a lifeline for the valley. The co-op finished laying the new pipes. Water flowed from my spring directly into the pastures of 5 ranches, neighbors who had stood beside me, who refused to be intimidated. We marked the opening with a small gathering. No media, no politicians, just old hands clasping over new valves, stories shared by firelight, and the promise that no outsider would ever rob this land again. Later that night, I sat alone on my porch. The air was thick with pine and dust. A soft breeze stirred the wind chimes my mother had hung decades ago. I looked out across the fields and thought about my father. He'd died defending this land from an oil lease years ago, dug his heels into the clay like it was part of his own blood. He didn't leave me money or power, but he left me a sense of honor. And now, I understood what he meant when he said, "You don't own land like this, son. It owns you. And when it's threatened, you answer." I did, and I wasn't the only one who learned something. Weeks after the HOA collapse, I started getting letters from residents, some apologizing, some explaining, but many thanking me. They told me they had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. They spoke of being kept in the dark, misled by empty newsletters and fake reports. One woman wrote, "I thought the pipeline was legal. I thought we were expanding responsibly. But I see now how easily comfort blinds us to corruption. Thank you for making us look twice." That hit me harder than I expected, because this wasn't just a fight about boundaries. It was a fight about accountability, and it reminded me that sometimes justice isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the sound of clean water flowing through honest pipes. It's the sigh of a neighbor who no longer feels afraid to speak. The land healed slowly. Grass regrew over the scars of the pipeline. The spring found its natural rhythm again, burbling up through the rock like it had for centuries. And I healed too. I used to carry bitterness like a second skin. But now I understood something deeper. We don't win by taking revenge. We win by restoring balance, by defending what matters, even when the odds feel stacked, even when the enemy has lawyers, lobbyists, and bank accounts 10 times our size. Because principles don't bow to profit, and history remembers those who stood their ground. One evening, months later, a truck pulled up to the gate. It was an older man, face lined with sun and time. He introduced himself as Gerald Clark, former HOA resident recently relocated. "I had to leave that place," he said, "after what happened." I couldn't look at it the same way. He handed me a small box. Inside was a plaque. It read, To the man who protected the source, may we all learn to protect what's right. I didn't have words. We shook hands, and he drove off into the dusk. I mounted the plaque on my gatepost the next morning. It hangs there still, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that one man with the truth can bring down an empire built on lies, and that no matter how deep they bury their theft, no matter how polished their speeches or expensive their suits, the land remembers, the water remembers, and so do we.